The giant rancher spotted handprints on her wrists when she reached for the coffee pot. The coffee pot had been mine for 11 years, and I knew every inch of it. The dent near the spout from the winter, I'd thrown it across the kitchen in a rage I'm not proud of. The place where the handle had been resoldered twice. The dark ring it left on the stovetop that I'd stopped trying to clean off sometime around the 3rd year alone. I knew how it sounded when it was full, a low slosh when you lifted it, and I knew by the sound she'd poured only about 1/3 of what was in there into her cup before she set it back. I was standing behind her. She didn't know I was watching. She'd reached for the pot with her left hand, and the sleeve of the coat she hadn't taken off in 2 days fell back just enough, and I saw them. 4 fingers on the inside of her wrist, a thumb on the outside, dark purple going to yellow at the edges. Somebody had grabbed her hard enough to stop her from moving somewhere she'd wanted to go. I didn't say anything. I turned around and went back to the table and sat down with my own cup, and when she came and sat across from me, I was looking out the window at the horses in the corral. That's how things started, not with me doing something, with me deciding not to. My name is Caleb Dunmore. I am 6 feet and 5 inches tall, and I weigh most seasons around 260 pounds. I know what I look like to people. I've known since I was 15 and started filling out in a way that made even grown men stand a little differently when I came through a door. It's a thing you learn to work around when you want to live quietly, which is what I've wanted for most of my life. I keep my voice down. I move slow. I don't plant my feet too wide or take up more room than I need. My father was a big man too, and he never learned any of that, and I watched what it cost him. He wasn't a cruel man. I want to be precise about that. He wasn't mean-spirited or looking to do harm. He was just large and loud, and he'd never been taught that the world didn't owe him room, so he took it wherever he went and wondered why people pulled back. I watched him his whole life wonder why people pulled back. I decided early on I wouldn't wonder that. The ranch sits 11 miles southeast of Laramie, Wyoming, in a bowl between 2 ridges where the wind does what it wants about 8 months of the year. I run cattle, about 140 head, and I have a part crow hand named Elias who comes by twice a week to help me with what my back won't let me do alone anymore. I've got 3 dogs of indeterminate breeding, named, in an act of what I thought was humor when they were pups, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, because I skipped Wednesday to see if anyone noticed. No one ever has, and a horse, a gray gelding named Porter, who has an opinion about everything and isn't shy about sharing it. I have not had a woman in this house since my mother died in 1879. That was 6 years ago. I don't say that to invite sympathy. It's just the fact of the matter. I'd had prospects over the years early on before I understood that what most women wanted when they married into a ranch was a ranch and a man to run it. And what they were less certain about was whether they wanted to be 11 miles from town through a Wyoming winter. I understood it. I didn't blame anyone. But I'd also stopped looking sometime around 1876 and hadn't picked it back up. The work filled it. Work always fills most of what's there to be filled if you do enough of it. The woman came to my door on a Tuesday in November. It was after dark. The temperature had dropped hard and fast that afternoon, the way it does out here, and there was ice in the ruts of the road. I heard her knock, and I thought at first it was the wind against the shutter that had worked loose off the west side window, because the knock was that light. 3 taps, then nothing. I sat there for a moment, then I went to the door. She was small. I noticed that the way you notice a thing that surprises you. Not small like a child, she was a grown woman. I could see that even in the lamplight through the doorway, 30 years old or near it, but small the way that made you understand immediately that she had no business being out in this alone. She had a coat that was a man's coat, too big for her. The sleeves turned back twice and the front of it pulled around her and held with both hands against the cold. She had a bag that looked like it weighed near as much as she did, and she was standing about 3 feet back from the door like she wasn't sure she'd done the right thing by knocking. She said she'd seen my lamp from the road. She said she was sorry to bother me. She said she was trying to get to Laramie and she'd been walking a long time. I stood there in the doorway. I am aware that I can be an alarming thing to find on the other side of a door at night. I stepped back and I said, "Come in out of the cold." I didn't say anything else. I didn't ask her anything or make any kind of announcement about what she could expect. I just stepped back from the door and turned and went to the stove to add wood to it. After a moment, I heard her step inside. The dogs came out of the corner to investigate. Monday and Tuesday were civil enough, but Thursday has always had the idea that she's in charge of things, and she came up and smelled the woman's coat hem with great thoroughness. The woman put her hand down low without crouching and let Thursday smell it, and Thursday decided whatever she'd been looking for was there and went back to her spot by the stove. I put the kettle on. I didn't ask if she wanted anything. I just put it on. I made up the back room that had been used for storage since my mother's time. There was a bed frame in there, and I had a mattress rolled up in the loft, and I brought it down and set it on the frame and laced it up onto the springs. I found 2 blankets that were clean. I did not explain why I was doing any of this, and she did not ask. She stood in the doorway of the back room holding her bag and watching me put the mattress down, and the only thing she said was that she could help, and I said I had it. When it was done, I told her the room was hers as long as she needed it. I told her breakfast was at 6 if she wanted it, and if she didn't, that was fine too. Then I went to my own room, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while before I lay down. I lay there thinking about how I hadn't thought twice about any of it. That was the thing I kept coming back to. I hadn't weighed anything or considered anything or wondered whether I was being a fool. I'd just done it the way you'd build a fire on a cold night, because the cold was there and the wood was there and you built the fire. I don't know what that says about me. I know some men would have turned her away, and I know some would have turned her away and thought they were being wise about it, and I know some would have let her in and spent the night congratulating themselves on their charity. I just let her in. That seemed like the beginning and end of it. She was at breakfast at 6. She'd changed out of the big coat and into a dress that was clean but worn thin at the cuffs and the collar. She'd put her hair up. She sat down at the table, and she didn't say good morning or apologize for being there or do any of the things people do when they're unsure of their welcome. She just sat down, and when I set a plate in front of her, she said thank you, 2 words, and then she ate. She ate like someone who hadn't eaten much in a while, not fast, not desperate, but with a care for every bite that you only see in people who have had reason to be uncertain about the next one. She drank 2 cups of coffee. She didn't ask me anything about myself, and I didn't ask her anything about herself. And when she was done, she stood and carried her plate to the basin and washed it and set it to dry without being asked to. Then she stood looking out the window at the morning. She said, "That's a good gray horse." I said, "Yes." She said, "What's his name?" I said, "Porter." She nodded. We stood there for a bit, both looking at Porter, and then I put my hat on and went outside, and after a minute I heard the back door open and close, and I looked back and she was headed toward the barn. The 3rd morning she asked me what needed doing, and I told her, and she did it. Not in a way that was performing usefulness, not hurrying around to show me she was earning her place, but the way a person who's known work all their life approaches it. Practical, steady. The stall that needed mucking, she mucked it without comment and without complaint. The tack that needed oiling, there was a bridle that had stiffened and needed working back before it cracked. She did that too, sitting on the barn floor in the cold with the neatsfoot oil and her hands moving over the leather slowly and correctly. She could split wood, which surprised me. Not that a woman couldn't, but that she was good at it, with a real economy of motion that came from knowledge as much as strength. She hit the wood where it wanted to be hit. I split most of a cord myself over 2 days in October, and she watched me do the first few pieces, and then she picked up the second axe and started in on the next one, and I didn't say anything. We worked down the pile. The sound of 2 axes going at different rhythms, and then finding each other and separating again. Porter watched all of this from the corral with his customary disapproval. Porter disapproves of most things. He disapproves of Elias on principle, he disapproves of any change to his routine, and he had up to then disapproved of strangers in his yard. But on the 5th day he walked to the fence line near where she was working and stood there watching her in a way that I recognized as interest rather than suspicion. She noticed him watching. She went to the fence and offered her hand flat. He smelled it, considered the situation, and then pressed his face into her palm and stood there. She didn't say anything to me about it, but I caught the corner of a smile. On the 4th day, I asked her name. She looked at me for a moment, and I understood that she was measuring something. Not whether to trust me, I think. More whether the name itself was something she could afford to let go of out here, where she was standing, and whether staying had risks she was weighing against other risks. She said Nora. I said Caleb. She said she knew. She'd seen a letter on the table. I said I hadn't meant to look, she said. Then she went quiet, and I thought she was going to leave it at that, but after a moment she said, Voss. Her name was Nora Voss. Her husband's name had been Carl Voss, and he'd been a miner, worked a lease east of here, nothing large but enough to live on. She said he'd been dead since the spring. She said the men who killed him had come back in October. She didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't ask. But I thought about those handprints. I thought about how you'd have to be standing in relation to a woman to put your hand on her wrist in exactly that way. Behind her, close enough that there was nowhere for her to go, pulling her back from wherever she'd been trying to go. I thought about the size of the hand from the span of the marks, not a small man. A man who used his size the way my father never did, but the way some men do, because they'd learned it worked. That night I lay in the dark and I thought about what it means to leave marks like that on a person. Not in an angry way, just turning the fact of it over. I didn't sleep much. In the second week, she started cooking. Not all of it, not pushing me out of any part of the kitchen. She just started contributing to it in a way that added to what was already happening rather than replacing it. One night I came in from the barn, and there was a pot of something on the stove that she'd made from what was in the larder, and it was better than what I would have made. I said so, and she nodded, and we ate it. There was a kind of negotiation that happened in that kitchen over those weeks, and neither of us talked about it directly. She learned what I needed done before I asked for it, and I learned what she needed: more blankets because she ran cold, a lamp in the back room instead of a candle, and most importantly, not to be asked questions about herself unless she was already talking. That last one I'd figured out by the second day. When she wanted to say something, she said it. When she didn't, she didn't. Pressing her produced nothing but a closed-down quality in her face that I didn't like seeing. I've been told I'm the same way. I wouldn't know. It's hard to see it in yourself. What I can tell you is that those weeks had a quality to them that I hadn't expected, a kind of texture to the days. I'd get up in the dark the way I always did before even the earliest light and build the fire back up, and most mornings, by the time the coffee was ready, she was already up and in the kitchen, and we'd drink it together in silence before going out to the work. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with everything that didn't need to be said. I noticed in those weeks what it was like to have someone else in the house. Not in the abstract, I'd thought about it plenty over the years, the idea of it, but in the particular. The sounds, the different weight of footsteps across the floor, the lamp still on in the back room when I passed it at night on my way to my room, someone else's dishes drying on the rack beside mine, small things, every one of them, but they accumulated. They made the house a different kind of place. I'd lived in it long enough that I'd stopped seeing it clearly. She made me see it again. Elias came on his regular days, and he watched all of this without comment, which, as I mentioned, is Elias' way of expressing everything. He's 40-something, I'm never quite sure, and he grew up partly on the reservation and partly working ranches through Wyoming and Colorado. And he's one of those men whose actual thoughts are a mystery, while everything he's thinking is perfectly legible if you've known him long enough. By the third week, when he came by on his Tuesday, I caught him and Nora talking out by the corral for about 20 minutes while I was on the other side of the barn, dealing with a fence post that had heaved out of the ground in the recent cold. I didn't hear what they said to each other. Elias mentioned, when we went over the accounting afterward, that Porter had taken to her. I said I knew. He said it like it was information he was choosing to share with me for reasons he wasn't going to explain. I said, "All right, Elias." He said, "All right," and rode out. I watched him go, then I went and found Nora, who was patching a place in the fence line where the wire had gone loose, and I worked the other end of it, and we stretched it back and stapled it down, and neither of us said anything about Elias. I liked that about her. She didn't talk about what didn't need talking about. On a Thursday in early December, I went into Laramie for supplies. Laramie is not a large town, but it's a real one, and I know most of the people in it by sight if not by name. The man at the feed and supply, Aldous Webb, has been there since before I started ranching, and he knows what I need better than I do most years. The woman who runs the dry goods, a widow named Sarah Hatch, has always been straightforward and fair. The man who owns the hotel, Bud Carlisle, is a fool but an honest one, which puts him a step above most. I went about my business, and I was loading the wagon in front of Webb's when I became aware that I was being discussed. This is not an unusual experience for me in Laramie. I'm hard to miss, and people have always talked. But this was different. I caught the word woman from two men who were standing at the corner, and they weren't talking to me, but their eyes came to me while they talked. I finished loading. I went to Webb's to settle the account. He was quieter than usual, which for Webb, who is a talker, is noticeable. He counted my change twice. I said, Aldous. He said, Caleb. I said, something on your mind. He looked at me, then he looked down at the counter. He said he'd heard I had a woman out at my place. He said, now look, he said it in the way a man says it when he's about to say something he's already decided he has a right to say. He said there were people who had business with that woman that he understood had gone unfinished, and he wasn't saying anything about it, but he thought I ought to know that it was known she was out there. I looked at him for a moment. I said, thank you, Aldous. I said I appreciated him telling me. He said he hadn't meant any offense. I said I knew that. I went out and got on the wagon and drove it back 11 miles in the cold, and the whole way I was working out in my mind what this meant and what I was going to do about it. Not in a heated way. I've found over the years that I think best when I'm moving, when there's work to do with my hands and the rest of me can just run through things. What I came to by the time I turned off the road onto my track was this. She was here, and she was safe here, and she was going to stay safe here, and whoever came looking was going to find me between them and her, and that was the whole of my position on the matter. It wasn't complicated. I told her that evening, not all of it. I told her I'd been in town and that it was known she was at my place. I watched her face. She didn't go to pieces. She didn't cry or argue or ask me what I was going to do. She sat very still for a moment, and there was a thing that happened in her face that was more like a closing down than a fear, like a house when the shutters go on the windows before a storm. She'd been through this before or something like it, and she knew the shape of it. She said I should go. I said where. She opened her mouth and then closed it. She didn't have an answer. I said Laramie won't be safer. Cheyenne won't be safer. Anywhere you're alone won't be safer. She said, I've been dealing with this alone. I said, I know. I said, you don't have to. She looked at me. It was a long look, measuring look. I've described her eyes before, gray, the kind that change with the light, and in that moment they were very particular, very direct. Not angry, not soft either, just looking at me and seeing what was there. She said, you don't know what these men are. I said, tell me. She did, not all of it at once. It came out over that evening, and into the next day in pieces, the way a thing comes out when someone isn't used to being asked to explain it. Carl Voss had owed money to a man named Pryor, Wade Pryor. She said the name with a specific flatness that told me she'd said it before and stopped expecting anything from the saying of it. Carl had owed Pryor a sum that had started as one thing and become another, the way those debts do, with interest compounded in ways that aren't written anywhere and can't be disputed because there's no document and no law that reaches out to where it happens. Carl had been trying to pay it down. He hadn't paid it down fast enough. Pryor had sent men. The men had come to their cabin in April. Carl had been outside when they came. She'd been inside and she'd heard it happen and she hadn't been able to stop it. She said the word heard very plainly, and I understood from the plainness of it that she carried what she'd heard the way you carry something too heavy that you can't put down. Afterward, the men had come inside. One of them, the younger one, she said, the one with the boy's face, had grabbed her wrist and told her the debt transferred, and that she'd be hearing from them soon about the terms of payment. She said I left before they came back to discuss the terms. I sat with that for a moment, then I said, what's the other one like, the older one? She said one of his eyes is damaged, milky. She said it like she was reciting a fact from a document. I said, all right. She said, Caleb. I said, yes. She said, these men have done this before. I'm not the first person they've collected from, and I won't be the last, and what I'm saying is that standing between them and me is not a small thing. I said, I know that. She said, do you? I said, I've been on this land 22 years, and I've seen what kind of men pass through here. I said I knew what I was looking at when I was looking at it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, why? I said, why what? She said, why would you do this? She wasn't accusing me of anything. She said it honestly, like a real question, like she genuinely wanted to understand the shape of it. I thought about it. I said, because you're here and it's my land, and I said you could stay. And what that means is that what happens to you while you're here is my business too. She looked at me for a long time. She had a way of looking at things without blinking that I'd noticed before, like she was making a map of what she saw. She said, all right. 3 days later, Elias came in on a Tuesday morning looking the way he looks when he's got information he's decided I need. He went through the accounting first, which told me the information was important enough that he'd set it aside to be last, like you do when something needs to sit in its proper context. At the end, he said, 2 men in Laramie, asking about a woman, the description matched. He said they were at the hotel and they'd been there 2 nights and they weren't doing anything else, just staying and asking questions. One of them had a bad eye. I said, thank you. He said the younger one came into Webb's asking questions too. Said he was looking for a cousin's widow. I said, and Webb? He said Webb didn't tell him much. Just that folks out here kept to themselves mostly. I appreciated that about Aldous Webb. A lot of things I don't appreciate about him, that I did. I said, all right, Elias. He said, all right. He stood up and put his hat on, and then he said, one more thing. He said the older one, Pryor's man, had a reputation going back 5 or 6 years. He'd heard about him from a man in Cheyenne who knew him by a different name. He said the reputation was specific and not good, and that the younger one was worse, actually, because he was still at an age where he thought it was a game. I said I'd keep that in mind. After he rode out, I went inside and I found Nora, and I told her what Elias had said. The same way I'd told her in Laramie, plain, no softening to it, because she didn't want softening and I didn't think she needed it. She was a grown woman who had already survived more than most people have to. She went still the way she had before, the shutters going on. I told her what I'd decided, that she should go to the back room when they came and stay there, that I'd handle it. She said, Caleb. She said my name in the particular way she had, like a hand placed on a person's arm. She said, I need you to hear me. She said these men have done this before, and what I mean is they've done this to other people, and those people tried to stand up and it didn't go the way they planned. I said, I'm not other people. She looked at me, not challenging, not arguing. Just looking, taking the measure of the statement. She said no, she said it slowly, no, you're not. Then she said, all right. She said, I'll go to the back room. They came on a Friday, about 3 in the afternoon. 2 horses, same as Elias said. They came in off the road without hurrying, which told me they weren't expecting trouble. The one with the bad eye, the older one, the one with Pryor's name behind him, was in front. He sat his horse the way men who have spent a long time in the saddle sit it, easy and economical, with a stillness that wasn't peaceful but watchful. The younger one behind him had that high-hip gun and a face that was still finding its way into what it was going to be. I came out onto the porch when they were still in the yard. I didn't say anything. I just stood there and let them see me. I've learned over the years that's usually enough to establish certain things. Not as a threat. I've never been someone who uses size as a threat. It was the lesson I took from my father, just as a fact. Here is what you're dealing with. Take a moment to be accurate about it. The older one pulled up about 20 feet from the porch and looked me over. He had the kind of face that's been outside in every kind of weather for a long time, creased and tanned and not particularly expressive except for the eyes, and the eyes were smart. I'll give him that. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't factored in. He said he was looking for a woman, said she was his cousin's widow and there was a family matter to settle. He said it pleasantly enough and with a surface of reasonableness that was convincing if you didn't hear what was underneath it. I heard it. I said there was no woman here. He looked at me for a moment. He looked at the ranch, the barn, the corral with Porter and the other horses. He looked at the woodpile, which was well laden enough for a hard winter, more than a single man usually puts up. Then he looked back at me. He said, well, he said he'd heard different. I said whatever he'd heard was wrong. I said he was welcome to ride back out to the road and continue on to wherever he was going. The younger one shifted in his saddle. He had an energy to him that was looking for somewhere to go, and I recognized it as the energy of someone who hasn't yet learned that most things aren't won by being fast. His hand moved without quite touching his gun, the way a nervous person's hand does when they're working themselves up to something. I looked at him, not at his hand, at his face. I let the look sit there until he understood that I'd seen the hand and wasn't particularly concerned. He went still. The older one said, now, look here. He started something about lawful business and a widow's obligation and property belonging to certain parties. I let him talk. I stood there on that porch with my rifle down at my side, and I let him say what he had to say, and I watched his horse, and I watched the younger man, and I watched the lane in case there was a third man they hadn't brought where I could see him. I've been on this land 22 years, and I know every angle of it, every place a man could come from that I wouldn't see until he was on me. I was keeping track. When the older one was done, I said, I've lived on this land for 22 years. My father died on this land, and I buried him here. I know every man in Laramie and every man on every ranch for 40 miles, and when I tell one of them something, they know it's the truth, because I've never been anything but honest with them in 22 years. So when I tell you there's no woman here, and when I tell you this is the last time you'll be welcome to ride into my yard, you ought to understand that's the end of the matter. I said it the way I say most things, which is without particular heat. A plain statement, the way you'd state a fact about the weather or the state of the road. The older one looked at me, really looked maybe for the first time. He was reassessing. There's a thing that happens sometimes when a big man speaks plainly and without anger. It takes a moment to read, because people expect the anger, expect the performance of it. They've learned that big men use their size like a weapon, and they know how to measure that. It's loud, it's hot, and you can work with loud, hot things. When it doesn't come, when there's just a fact laid out in the open air like a stone that was always there, it lands differently, heavier, more settled. He looked at the rifle I was holding down at my side. He looked at my face. He looked at his partner, who was now sitting very still with both hands visible. He looked at the land around us, the emptiness of it, 11 miles of it between here and town. He said, "All right then." He didn't say anything else. He turned his horse and they rode out of the yard, back to the road, and I stood there on the porch and I watched them go. I watched until the dust was gone and the road was just a road. Then I went inside and I called to Nora that it was done. She came out of the back room and I was still standing by the front window watching the road, the empty road, just making sure. She came and stood beside me and we watched it together for a while. The empty road, the flat light on the winter grass, Porter moving along the fence line with his ears forward, smelling where they'd been. She said, "Are they gone?" I said, "They're gone." She was quiet for a moment. She was close enough that I could see, out of the corner of my eye, that her hands were clasped in front of her. She'd been afraid in that room. That was plain in the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself now that whatever had been holding her together could relax a little. She'd been afraid, and she'd stayed quiet, and she'd trusted me to handle it. That wasn't a small thing, I understood, from a woman who'd had reason not to trust many people. She said, "What did you say to them?" I said, "Not much." She said, "Caleb." She said my name the way she had before. She said, "What did you say?" I told her, plain as I'd said it to the men themselves, all of it in order. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When I was done, she was quiet for a longer moment than usual. Then she said, 22 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "And you've been alone here most of that." I didn't answer. It wasn't really a question. She was looking out the window. She said, "And they believed you because of it." I said, "I think they believed me because it was true." She said, "Both things can be true." She was right about that. She turned and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I don't know exactly what was said in that, but something was. Some kind of reckoning that didn't need words and wouldn't have been improved by them. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it and not make anything smaller than it is." I said, "All right." She said, "I've had men protect me before. Not many, but some. My father when I was young. Carl sometimes when he was being what he was trying to be." She stopped for a moment. She said there were men in those towns Carl worked in, good men who knew what was going on and had ideas about what I should do, and some of them tried in their way to help. I waited. She said none of them did it the way you just did. She said it without embellishment. Without making it a speech. She said without making me feel like I owed something for it, without it being about them. I said, "It's your life, Nora. Nobody should be deciding what happens to it but you." She looked at me for a long time. Then she did something I wasn't expecting. She reached out and she took my hand in both of hers, my right hand, the one that had been holding the rifle, and she just held it. She wasn't small about it. She held my whole hand the way you'd hold something you'd found and weren't going to put down. Her two hands around mine. I could feel the calluses on her palms from the work she'd been doing. She said, "I'd like to stay here, if you'll have me, not as a guest." She said she'd pull her weight, and she didn't need any promises about what it would be, and she wasn't asking for any. I looked down at her hands holding mine. Her wrists. The bruising was still visible, going from that greenish yellow that means it's healing toward the edge of normal skin. I said I'd be glad to have you. She didn't smile exactly. There was something that moved across her face that was quieter than a smile and truer. We stood there a while longer watching the road. The light was going out of the afternoon and turning everything that flat gold it gets before dark in November. Porter walked up to the fence line closest to the house and stopped there and looked at us with the expression he has when he's decided to weigh in on something. Nora made a sound that was almost a laugh. First time I'd heard her laugh. It was short and real, nothing performed about it. She said, "That horse." I said, "He thinks he runs things." She said, "Doesn't he?" I said, "More or less." We went in after that and I built up the fire and she put coffee on and we sat on either side of the kitchen table while the dark came down outside. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The fire made its sounds and the dogs settled on the floor and the wind came up around the eaves the way it always does out here at night. The way it's been doing around this house for the 22 years I've been here and the years before that when my father built it and my mother kept it. She poured more coffee into my cup at some point without asking. Just reached over with the pot and poured it. I watched her hand on the pot, the wrists visible below the sleeve, that bruising going to nothing day by day. A small thing, the coffee, a plain thing, but a person who pours your coffee without asking has made a decision about where they are. I sat there and I thought about the men riding out of my yard. I thought about the older one's face when he'd taken the full measure of me and the land around me and decided that what I'd said was the end of it. I thought about 22 years of building a thing that was credible, building a name people could put a known quantity to, and I thought about how I'd never aimed to build it for any reason beyond the practical one, and how it had turned out, on a Friday afternoon in November, to be good for something I hadn't anticipated. And I thought about what she'd said. None of them did it the way you just did. I don't dwell on things usually. I'm not built for dwelling, but I let myself hold on to that for a moment that night. Let it sit in me like heat from a stove. It sat right. The winter came in hard about a week later. The real winter, not the cold snap that had been threatening since October, the actual arrival of the thing. With 3 feet of snow over 2 days and temperatures that dropped to where your breath froze in the air before it got anywhere. We worked it together. She turned out to be good with the horses in a way I hadn't expected. Not just comfortable around them, but genuinely skilled, with a patience that they responded to and a knowledge of their moods and preferences that you can't learn from a book. She knew when Porter was going to be difficult before I did, which I'll admit was galling and also useful. She figured out the way to approach the littlest of the 3 barn horses, a skittish mare named Delia who'd been difficult since I'd bought her 2 years ago, and within a week she had Delia eating from her hand. I watched her with Delia one morning, standing in the barn in the cold light, her breath making small clouds, talking to the horse very quietly. Delia's ears were forward and her eyes were soft. I'd spent 2 years not quite getting through to that horse. I didn't say anything about it, but I watched. In December, a letter came for her. I brought it in from the post rider and set it on the table, and she looked at it and went pale, just a shade, in a way that someone who didn't know her face wouldn't have caught. Then she opened it and read it, and then she handed it to me without saying anything. It was from an attorney in Cheyenne, Carl's estate such as it was. The debt to Pryor or the man who'd been collecting for Pryor had been settled by the sale of the mining lease. There was a formal enumeration of what had been paid and to whom. It was dry and legalistic, and what it amounted to was, the matter was closed. There was nothing outstanding. No legitimate claim remained. I read it twice, then I set it on the table between us. I said, "It's done." She said, "Yes." I said, "You can go anywhere you want now." She looked up at me. She understood what I was doing and why I was doing it. I said it because it was true, and she needed to hear that I knew it. That nothing here was keeping her but what she chose. That I hadn't done any of this in expectation of something owed. She said, "I know." She said it quietly. She said, "That's why I'm staying." Things went on. The winter broke the way winters do out here, suddenly, as if the world had made a decision overnight and implemented it. The grass came back yellow-green and then fuller, and the cattle spread out onto the new growth, and I rode fence in the long evenings while the light lasted until 9 o'clock with the smell of the earth warming up again around me. She stayed. I want to be precise about that because it means something specific. She didn't stay out of gratitude. I know what gratitude looks like, and it's a different quality. It has an anxious edge to it, a person always making sure the account is squared. She didn't stay out of need, or not primarily, because after the attorney's letter she had the means to go somewhere. She stayed because she decided to, with the same practical, unadorned conviction she brought to everything else. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring, which my mother had kept up, and which I'd let go to thistle after she died. She ordered seeds from a catalog, and she turned the bed over herself and planted it and kept it. And by June there were things coming up in it that I hadn't had fresh off the land since I was a young man. I didn't remark on it, and she didn't make a production of it. It was just there. Elias registered the garden with the same silence with which he registered everything, which is to say I saw him look at it twice, and then say nothing, which for Elias is a standing ovation. There was a Sunday in June where we rode out together to check the east pasture fence, just the two of us on horseback in the long morning light, and I remember looking over at her on her horse. She'd been riding Delia, who went for her now without any fuss at all, and thinking that she looked like she'd been on this land as long as I had. Not a visitor, not a guest, something else. A person whose presence has settled into a place. I didn't say that to her. It would have been a lot of words for something that didn't need them. There's something I want to try to say, and I'm not sure I can say it right. I've been big and quiet and self-sufficient my whole adult life, and those aren't bad things to be. I know they aren't. I've built something real on this land, I've kept it in good order and dealt honestly with every person I've dealt with, and I've done it without asking anything of anybody that I couldn't repay. That's a life. That's not nothing. But there's a thing that happens when you've lived long enough inside only your own opinion of yourself. You stop being sure of where you actually stand. Not your land, not your cattle, not any of the things that can be measured and evaluated and found to be good or not good. I mean you, the man inside the work. Whether what you are, stripped of what you've built, amounts to something worth being. I hadn't had a straight answer to that in a long time. And then a woman who'd had every reason to see men at their worst looked at me, not at my land and not at what I could offer her, and not at what standing in this county attached to my name, but at me, and found something she decided was worth staying for. Found it worth staying for when she had other options. Found it worth saying so plainly. A man can go a long time without anything like that. It doesn't make you less without it, but it makes you more with it, and when it comes, you understand what you'd been carrying without knowing you were carrying it. She asked me once in the spring about the dent in the coffee pot. I've been surprised she hadn't asked sooner since it was not a small dent and the pot was not a large one. I told her about the winter I'd thrown it and the rage it had come out of, and she said what was the rage about. I told her. It was a long story, the kind of thing I don't usually tell people, about a year I'd had before I came here and what it had done to me and who I'd been before I figured out how to be who I was now. I told her the whole of it, sitting on the porch in the evening with the last of the light. She listened the whole way through. She didn't try to make it easier or tell me what she thought I should feel about it. She just listened, the way she listens, fully, without performing it. When I was done, she said, "You're not that man anymore." I said I wasn't sure. She said, "I am." She said it like she'd measured it, like she'd been given a question and applied herself to it with the same care she brought to everything else and arrived at an answer she was satisfied with. You couldn't argue with her when she spoke that way. Not because she'd get angry, but because arguing would have meant saying her judgment wasn't sound, and I'd had enough evidence by then that her judgment was about the soundest thing I'd encountered. I sat there with that. I sat there on that porch in the June evening with the smell of the garden she'd planted, and the sound of the horses in the corral, and the last of the light going out across the grass. It sat right, it sat better than right. It sat the way a thing sits when it's been a long time coming, and has finally found where it belongs. The coffee pot is still dented. I offered to get a new one in the fall when I was in town. She said she didn't want a new one. She said the dent gave it character. She said it was useful and it did its job, and what was the point of replacing a useful thing because it wasn't perfect? I said I supposed she was right. She said, "You know I'm right." She was. That's the whole of it. A woman who'd been through the worst of what this country can do to a person came to my door out of the dark and cold, and I let her in, and I stood between her and what was following her, and she looked at all of it clearly and decided to stay. Decided I was worth staying for. I don't know that I'm an easy man. I'm big and I'm quiet, and I've been alone long enough that I'd stopped being sure I remembered how to be anything else. But she managed me without appearing to manage me at all. And every morning she reaches for that old dented coffee pot, and I watch her wrists where there's nothing left to see anymore, and I think about what it means to have a thing you built be good enough for something you didn't plan for. That's what it comes down to. A life you built for yourself, and a woman who looked at it straight and found it good. There's a thing that happened in town in March that I should tell, because it's part of the picture. I went in for a load of lumber. I had repairs to do on the east barn wall where the planking had gone soft over the winter, and I was at the lumber yard loading the wagon when Walt Greer came over. Walt Greer runs cattle about 8 miles north of me, and we've always been on decent terms, the way two men who see each other 4 or 5 times a year and don't have any cause for conflict can be. He's a fair man, practical, not a gossip, which I respect. He came over and he helped me shift a few of the longer boards without being asked, and when we were done, he stood there for a moment and said, "I hear you've got a woman out at your place now." I said I did. He said, "Good." He said it like it was a simple thing, like the answer to a question that had been sitting open for a while. He said, "Caleb, I've been watching you work that land for a long time, and I've always thought it could use a second pair of hands." I said I'd managed. He said, "I know you managed. That's not what I meant." I thought about that on the drive home. The particular way he'd said, "I know you managed," not as a compliment, not as a criticism, but as an acknowledgement of something that was just a fact. The way you acknowledge that a man has carried something a long way and here is a place he can set it down. There was another thing too, and this one I've thought about more. About 3 weeks after the two men came and went from my yard, I got a message through Elias, through a man Elias knew in Laramie who knew the right people. That Pryor, the man those two had been working for, was no longer a going concern. He'd come afoul of his own methods somewhere up in Montana, and the arrangement had been dissolved, as these arrangements are. The men who'd come to my yard, Elias understood, were not going to be coming back. I told Nora this when Elias brought the word. She sat with it for a minute. Then she said, "It's strange." I said, "What is?" She said, "Being afraid of something for long enough that you start to mistake the fear for the thing itself." She said, "Now that it's actually over, I'm not sure what to do with having been afraid that long." I said, "You do the next thing." She looked at me. I said, "That's all there is. You do the next thing and then the thing after that. That's how it stops being what you're carrying and starts being what you've been through." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is that how you got through whatever you told me about on the porch?" I said it was. She said, "Did it work?" I said, "Mostly." I said there was still the dent in the coffee pot. She laughed at that, a real laugh bigger than the short one she'd let out watching Porter that first afternoon. It went through the kitchen and the dogs looked up, and I think that was the first time in a while the house had had that sound in it. Maybe the first time in 6 years. My mother had been a woman who laughed easily. I liked the sound of it. There was a Sunday in July. I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm telling it as it comes back to me, which is not always in order, where we had a storm come through fast and hard, the kind that builds on the mountains and rolls down with more intention than a summer storm has any right to have. We'd seen it coming most of the afternoon, and we'd got the horses in and battened what needed battening, and then the sky turned that particular yellow-green that you only see right before the serious weather arrives, and I came in from the yard and found her standing at the kitchen window watching it. She hadn't grown up in Wyoming. She'd told me she was from Ohio originally, farm country there too, but different. The storms were different. She'd told me the first hard one had frightened her, and she'd thought she was past being frightened by things. I came and stood beside her at the window. The sky was moving fast, clouds going purple-black at the edge of them, and the light was wrong in the way that only happens before a real storm. Porter and the horses were settled in the barn. The dogs were already inside. There wasn't anything more to do but be inside and let it go past. She said, "Is this a bad one?" I said, "Probably medium." She said, "What does a bad one look like?" I said, "Worse than this." I said, "We'll be all right." She didn't say anything else. She stood there and I stood there, and the storm arrived with a sound like something tearing, and the rain hit the windows sideways and the lamp flickered. She didn't move. She stood her ground, watching it come. I admired that. I should say so, because I don't always say the things I admire about a person when I admire them. At some point in the middle of the worst of it, without either of us deciding to, she'd come to stand closer, and my arm had come up around her shoulders. Neither of us made anything of it. The storm was loud, and the house shook a little in the wind, and her shoulder was solid and warm under my arm, and that was what it was. The storm passed. The light came back clean the way it always does after a hard rain, everything washed and the grass very green. She stepped back and I stepped back, and she went to put the kettle on, and I went out to check the barn. After things like that, you don't always say anything. You don't have to. I was talking before about a man living long enough inside his own opinion of himself that he starts to lose the thread of where he actually stands. I want to come back to that because I didn't say the whole of it. The thing that Nora did, coming into my house and making a decision to stay in it and to do the work of it, wasn't just that she made me feel chosen, though she did. It was that she made me visible. That's the word I've come to for it. Not in any dramatic way, not in the way of being watched or noticed or having anybody look at you, but in the way of being known. Having someone present who had taken the full inventory of you, the dent in the coffee pot, and the reason for it, and the long years of solitude and the work and the way you handle yourself when things come down to it, and had not looked away. When you've been alone a long time, you become, in a certain way, a little abstract to yourself. You exist in the context of the work and the land and the things you keep in order, and that gives you shape, but it's not quite the same thing as being known to another person. Another person knows the things the work can't know about you, the way you look when you're tired, what you're like on a morning when everything goes wrong. The specific way your silence sits in a room when you're pleased about something versus the way it sits when you're working out a problem. She learned all of that over the months, and she didn't use any of it against me or as a tool for anything. She just held it, the way she held my hand that day after the men rode out, both hands, nothing given back. I hadn't known I wanted that known. I hadn't thought about wanting it at all, but there it was. There's one more thing. October came around again. The anniversary of Carl's death, I realized, was somewhere in that month, and I watched to see how she was with it. She went quieter for a few days, which was her way of processing things that mattered. She went out one evening on Delia alone, not long, just a couple of miles. And when she came back, she took the horse in and tended to her and came inside and sat at the kitchen table. I poured her coffee without asking, her way because I'd learned it. She sat with it for a while. Then she said, Carl was not a bad man. She'd said something like that before the night she'd told me the story. But this time she said it differently. She said he was not a bad man and he was not good at being a man, and those things were both true, and I've been trying to decide how to keep both of them. I said, you don't have to decide. You can carry both. She said, can you? I said, yes. I said that's what people are mostly made of, both things. She looked at me. She said, you carry both things. I said I did. I said everybody does one way or another. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She said, thank you, she said, for tonight, for not trying to make it simple. I said things that aren't simple don't get better by being made simple. She said no, she said they don't. She drank her coffee and then she went to bed, and I sat there in the kitchen alone for a while with the fire, and I thought about Carl Voss, who I'd never known, and what it was to be a man who'd tried and not gotten to where he was trying to go. I thought about what I'd built here, and how much of it had been trying too, and what had made the difference. Luck, some of it. Stubbornness. Starting where I started, which wasn't easy but wasn't the worst either. And I thought about the woman in the back room, in the room that was hers now, had been for a year, and what it meant to be the right thing in someone's life after they'd been through the wrong things for long enough. That's a responsibility. I knew it was a responsibility. I didn't take it lightly. But I was glad of it. That's the last thing I want to say. I was glad of it in a way I hadn't expected to be glad of anything at my age, out here, 11 miles from town in a bowl between two ridges where the wind does what it wants. A woman who'd lost everything had come to my door, and I'd stepped back from it, and she'd stayed, and I was the man she stayed with. That matters. A man working alone for 22 years, building a thing that nobody is watching him build. It matters that it was worth something to somebody. It matters that what you are, underneath the work, was good enough for someone who needed a reason to believe in good enough. The coffee pot has a dent in it. It still works fine.